Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she watched her father polish his military medals every Sunday morning while telling stories of his time in Vietnam. Those stories planted a seed in her young heart that would eventually bloom into a fierce determination to join the military herself. At 18, Sarah enlisted in the Army. She was one of only 3 women in her basic training unit, and the drill sergeants made sure she knew it. They pushed her harder than the men, questioned her commitment, and constantly reminded her that combat was no place for a woman. But Sarah had inherited her father's stubborn streak. Every push-up they demanded, she did 20 more. Every mile they ordered her to run, she ran 2. After completing her basic training with honors, Sarah requested assignment to military police. She wanted to be on the front lines, protecting fellow soldiers and civilians in conflict zones. Her superiors tried to steer her toward administrative roles or medical support, but Sarah persisted. She had proven herself capable of handling whatever challenges came her way. Her first deployment took her to Afghanistan in 2008. The Taliban had been increasing their attacks on coalition forces, and American troops were stretched thin across the mountainous terrain. Sarah was assigned to a forward operating base near Kandahar, where her unit was responsible for convoy security and checkpoint operations. The work was dangerous, but Sarah thrived in the high-stakes environment. During her first 6 months in Afghanistan, Sarah participated in dozens of missions. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated potential ambushes, the way local children suddenly disappeared from the streets, how shopkeepers would quickly close their doors and windows, the nervous glances of drivers approaching checkpoints. These skills would prove invaluable in the months ahead. Sarah's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, initially had reservations about having a woman in such a dangerous assignment. But Sarah's performance quickly changed his mind. She was calm under pressure, accurate with her weapon, and possessed an intuitive understanding of the local dynamics that made her invaluable for intelligence gathering. The Afghan women and children, who typically avoided male soldiers, would often approach Sarah with information about insurgent activities. One evening in late October, Sarah was returning from a routine patrol when she noticed unusual activity near the base perimeter. Several men were moving through the shadows carrying what appeared to be heavy equipment. She alerted the watch commander and requested permission to investigate. Her instincts proved correct when they discovered the men were placing improvised explosive devices along the main access road. Sarah's vigilance had prevented what could have been a devastating attack on a supply convoy scheduled to arrive the next morning. The incident earned Sarah recognition from her superiors and respect from her fellow soldiers. She was no longer seen as the woman trying to prove herself in a man's world. She was simply a good soldier who happened to be a woman. This acceptance allowed her to focus entirely on the mission, rather than constantly battling prejudice and doubt. As winter approached, intelligence reports indicated increased Taliban activity in the region. Coalition forces were planning a major operation to clear insurgents from several strategic valleys. Sarah's unit would play a crucial role in establishing security checkpoints and maintaining supply lines during the operation. The mission was expected to last several weeks and would take them deep into Taliban-controlled territory. Sarah spent her evenings writing letters to her family back home. She couldn't tell them about the specific dangers she faced, but she tried to convey her sense of purpose and dedication. Her younger brother had recently joined the Marines and was preparing for his own deployment to Iraq. In her letters, she encouraged him to stay focused and trust his training, never revealing the fear that gnawed at her own stomach before each mission. The night before the operation began, Sarah cleaned her M4 carbine with extra care. She had been issued 210 rounds of ammunition, standard for extended operations in hostile territory. She checked each magazine, ensuring the rounds were seated properly and the springs functioned smoothly. Her sidearm, a Beretta M9, contained 15 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. She had trained with these weapons thousands of times, but she had never imagined how precious each round would become. The morning of November 15th dawned clear and cold. Sarah's unit consisted of 12 soldiers divided into 3 teams. They would be operating approximately 40 miles from the main base, establishing checkpoints along mountain roads that were known insurgent supply routes. The terrain was rugged and provided countless hiding places for enemy fighters who knew every rock and ravine. As their convoy departed the forward operating base, Sarah felt the familiar mix of anticipation and nervousness that preceded dangerous missions. She had participated in similar operations before, but something about this one felt different. The intelligence briefings had been more urgent, the senior officers more tense. Taliban activity in the target area had increased significantly over the past month, and there were reports of foreign fighters joining local insurgent groups. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying Sarah's unit, plus additional supplies and equipment. They would establish a temporary outpost in an abandoned village that provided commanding views of 3 separate valley approaches. From there, they would conduct patrols and establish checkpoints to disrupt enemy movement and gather intelligence on insurgent activities. The first 2 days of the operation proceeded smoothly. Sarah's team established their checkpoint on a narrow mountain road that served as a primary route between Taliban strongholds. They searched vehicles, questioned travelers, and documented movement patterns that would help intelligence analysts understand enemy logistics networks. The work was tedious but important, and Sarah took pride in knowing their efforts were making it more difficult for insurgents to move weapons and supplies. On the evening of the second day, Sarah noticed that the normal flow of civilian traffic had virtually ceased. In the past 48 hours, they had processed dozens of vehicles carrying farmers, merchants, and families traveling between villages. But now the road was eerily quiet. Her experience had taught her that when civilians avoided an area, it usually meant they had been warned of impending violence. She reported her observations to Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who shared her concerns. Intelligence reports indicated that a large group of Taliban fighters had been moving through the region, possibly planning a coordinated attack on coalition positions. Mitchell decided to reinforce Sarah's checkpoint with additional personnel and equipment, but the reinforcements would not arrive until the following afternoon. That night, Sarah lay awake in her sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the mountain wilderness. The silence that had seemed peaceful just days earlier now felt ominous and threatening. She checked her weapon one more time before trying to sleep, unaware that within hours she would be fighting for her life with every round counting toward survival. The attack began at 4:47 a.m., with a rocket-propelled grenade that struck the abandoned building where Sarah's team had established their temporary command post. The explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence and sent concrete debris flying in all directions. Sarah was thrown from her sleeping position behind a makeshift barrier, her ears ringing from the blast and dust filling her lungs. Training took over immediately. Without conscious thought, Sarah grabbed her weapon and ammunition, rolled toward the nearest defensive position, and began scanning for targets through the smoke and debris. The enemy had chosen their timing perfectly, attacking during the darkest hour when visibility was minimal, and most soldiers would be disoriented from sleep. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions surrounding their checkpoint. The Taliban had positioned fighters on the high ground overlooking the road, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped Sarah's team in the valley below. Bullets struck the rocks around her position, sending sparks and stone fragments into the air. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper sound of machine gun fire, indicating that the enemy had brought significant firepower to the engagement. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, Sarah's team leader, was shouting orders over the radio, trying to coordinate their defense while calling for immediate reinforcements. But the nearest coalition forces were over an hour away, and their small team would have to hold their position until help arrived. Sarah could see 3 of her teammates taking cover behind their armored vehicle, returning fire toward the muzzle flashes on the ridgeline. The enemy had clearly planned this attack carefully. They knew the terrain advantages and had positioned fighters to block the most likely escape routes. Sarah realized that their checkpoint location, which had provided excellent visibility for monitoring road traffic, now made them sitting ducks in a well-orchestrated ambush. The abandoned buildings that had provided shelter were now crumbling under sustained enemy fire. Sarah's M4 carbine barked as she engaged targets moving among the rocks above their position. She had trained for situations like this, but the reality was more chaotic and terrifying than any simulation. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with dust and smoke, making it difficult to breathe. Her heart pounded as adrenaline surged through her system, sharpening her focus despite the overwhelming sensory input. Private First Class Tommy Chen, the youngest member of their team, was pinned down behind a concrete barrier about 20 meters from Sarah's position. She could see him frantically trying to reload his weapon while bullets struck the wall above his head. His face was pale with fear, and Sarah realized that this was his first real combat experience. She began providing covering fire to allow him to move to a more secure position. The enemy fighters were well-disciplined and persistent. Rather than conducting a quick hit-and-run attack, they maintained steady pressure on the checkpoint, indicating they were prepared for an extended engagement. Sarah noticed that they were using fire and movement tactics, with some fighters providing covering fire while others advanced to better positions. This suggested they had received military training and were not simply local insurgents with basic weapons. Specialist Kevin Walsh, the team's communications specialist, was working desperately to maintain radio contact with their command post. The mountainous terrain made communications difficult under normal circumstances, and the stress of combat was making it even harder to establish clear connections. He reported that reinforcements were en route, but would not arrive for at least 45 minutes. Sarah realized they would have to survive on their own until then. As the battle continued, Sarah began to assess their ammunition situation. She had started the engagement with 7 30-round magazines for her M4, plus the 15 rounds in her sidearm. She had already expended 2 full magazines and was working on her third. At this rate of fire, she would be running low on ammunition long before help arrived. She needed to make every shot count while maintaining enough firepower to keep the enemy at bay. The Taliban fighters began probing their defensive perimeter, attempting to identify weak points where they could break through. Sarah watched as several enemy fighters moved through a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern side of the checkpoint. She called out their position to Sergeant Rodriguez, who redirected fire toward the approaching threat. The coordinated response forced the enemy fighters to retreat, but Sarah knew they would try again from a different angle. Corporal Lisa Park, the team's medic, was treating Specialist Johnson, who had been wounded by shrapnel from the initial rocket attack. His left arm was bleeding heavily, and Park was working to stop the bleeding while staying low to avoid enemy fire. Sarah provided security while Park worked, scanning the surrounding area for threats and maintaining radio communication with the other team members. The enemy fire was becoming more accurate as the Taliban fighters adjusted their aim and found the range to the checkpoint. Bullets were striking closer to the defenders' positions, and Sarah realized that they were gradually being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. She counted at least 15 different firing positions, indicating that the enemy force significantly outnumbered their 6-person team. Sarah's tactical mind was analyzing the situation even as she continued engaging targets. The enemy had positioned fighters to block their primary escape route down the mountain road. Other fighters occupied the high ground, making movement in any direction extremely dangerous. Their armored vehicle provided some protection, but it was not designed to withstand the concentrated fire they were receiving. The sound of incoming mortar rounds caused Sarah to flatten herself against the ground. The first round struck about 50 meters away, showering the area with dirt and rocks. The second round landed closer, and Sarah realized the enemy was adjusting their aim. If the Taliban had mortars, the situation had become even more desperate. The checkpoint's fixed position made them sitting ducks for indirect fire weapons. Sergeant Rodriguez made the difficult decision to abandon their current positions and move to a more defensible location among the ruins of the abandoned village. The movement would be dangerous, requiring each team member to cross open ground while under enemy observation. But staying in their current positions would mean certain death once the enemy mortars found their range. Sarah volunteered to provide covering fire while the wounded Johnson was moved first. She emptied another magazine, engaging multiple targets, forcing the enemy fighters to keep their heads down, while Corporal Park and Private Chen carried Johnson to safety. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her as she realized how much her teammates were depending on her accuracy and judgment. As the team began their tactical withdrawal, Sarah noticed that her ammunition supply was becoming critically low. She had 3 magazines remaining for her M4, and her sidearm was still fully loaded. But at the current rate of expenditure, she would be out of rifle ammunition within minutes. The thought of being defenseless against a determined enemy attack sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. The ruins of the abandoned village provided better cover than their original checkpoint position, but Sarah knew their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The Taliban fighters had followed their movement and were now establishing new firing positions among the rocks and rubble that surrounded the village. What had initially appeared to be a random attack was revealing itself as a carefully planned operation designed to trap and eliminate. The small American unit, Sarah, found herself positioned behind the remains of a stone wall that had once been part of someone's home. The family who had lived here had fled years ago when the fighting intensified, leaving behind only crumbling walls and memories. Now those same walls were providing protection for American soldiers fighting for their lives against an enemy that knew this terrain intimately. The enemy fire had intensified, rather than diminished during their movement. Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of bullets passing close overhead, and the sharp crack when rounds struck the stones near her position. She was down to 2 full magazines for her M4, and each shot had to be carefully aimed and justified. There was no ammunition to waste on suppressive fire or hasty shots at unclear targets. Specialist Johnson's condition was deteriorating despite Corporal Park's medical treatment. He had lost significant blood from the shrapnel wounds, and his face was becoming increasingly pale. Park was doing everything possible with limited medical supplies, but Johnson needed immediate evacuation to a field hospital. The problem was that no helicopter could land in their current position while under enemy fire, and ground evacuation would be impossible until reinforcements arrived. Sergeant Rodriguez was coordinating their defense while simultaneously trying to establish communication with command. The radio was providing intermittent contact, but the mountainous terrain and enemy jamming equipment were making it difficult to maintain clear communication. He had managed to confirm that reinforcements were en route, but their estimated arrival time kept being pushed back as the relief force encountered obstacles and enemy resistance. Sarah watched as enemy fighters moved through the village ruins, using the same stone walls and buildings for cover that her team was relying on for protection. The Taliban had the advantage of familiarity with the terrain, and they were using that knowledge to gradually close the distance to the American positions. She could see at least 3 fighters moving through a collapsed building about 100 meters to her north. The mortar fire had stopped temporarily, but Sarah knew it would resume once the enemy observers adjusted their positions and reacquired targets. The brief respite allowed her to assess their tactical situation more carefully. They were surrounded on 3 sides, with the 4th side blocked by a steep cliff that made escape impossible. The enemy was systematically reducing their defensive perimeter, using superior numbers to overwhelm the small American unit. Private Chen had found a position that provided good fields of fire toward the main enemy approach routes. But Sarah noticed that his shooting had become increasingly erratic. The stress of combat was affecting his accuracy, and he was expending ammunition at an unsustainable rate. She called out to him, reminding him to slow his rate of fire and make each shot count. Conservation of ammunition was becoming critical to their survival. Sarah's own shooting had remained accurate despite the stress and chaos of the engagement. Her father's emphasis on marksmanship training during her childhood was paying dividends now. Every shot she fired was aimed at a specific target, and she was achieving a high percentage of hits. But even with careful shot placement, her ammunition was disappearing quickly as the engagement continued. The enemy began using a new tactic, sending small groups of fighters to probe different sections of the American perimeter. These probing attacks were designed to identify weak points and force the defenders to reveal their positions and capabilities. Sarah realized that the Taliban commander was gathering intelligence for a final coordinated assault that would overwhelm their depleted unit. Corporal Park had moved Johnson to the most protected position available, but she was running low on medical supplies. The team's first aid kits were designed for basic battlefield injuries, not the extensive trauma care that Johnson required. She was improvising bandages from torn clothing and using combat gauze to control bleeding, but Johnson needed surgical intervention that was impossible under current circumstances. The sound of approaching helicopters briefly raised hopes among the defenders, but the aircraft were forced to turn away when they came under heavy enemy fire. Sarah watched the helicopters disappear behind the mountain ridgeline, knowing that their only chance of immediate medical evacuation had just vanished. The enemy had positioned anti-aircraft weapons in the area, making helicopter operations extremely dangerous. Sarah's M4 carbine clicked empty as she engaged a fighter who had gotten dangerously close to their perimeter. She quickly changed magazines, but the metallic sound of the empty rifle seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. She was down to her last full magazine plus the partial magazine she had just removed. Her sidearm remained fully loaded, But 15 pistol rounds would not last long against a determined enemy assault. The Taliban fighters had noticed the decrease in defensive fire from the American positions. They began moving more aggressively, taking advantage of what they perceived as weakening resistance. Sarah could see enemy fighters advancing through multiple approach routes, coordinating their movements to arrive at the American perimeter simultaneously. Specialist Walsh reported that he had lost radio contact with their command post entirely. The enemy jamming had become more effective, or their radio equipment had been damaged by the sustained fire. Either way, they were now completely cut off from outside support and reinforcement. Whatever happened next, they would face it alone. Sarah found herself thinking about her family back in Texas. Her father would be proud of how she was handling herself in combat, but she wished she could see him one more time to tell him how much his training and guidance had meant to her. Her mother would be worried sick if she knew what was happening. And Sarah hoped that if something happened to her, her parents would understand that she had died doing what she believed was right. The enemy mortar fire resumed with increased accuracy. The first round landed within 20 meters of Sarah's position, close enough that she felt the concussion wave and was showered with debris. She pressed herself closer to the stone wall, knowing that the next round might be even closer. The Taliban forward observers had clearly adjusted their aim and were now bracketing the American positions. Sergeant Rodriguez called for the team to prepare for a final defensive stand. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Their wounded team member was in critical condition, and they were surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them at least 3-1. But they were American soldiers, and they would fight until the last round was fired and the last breath was drawn. Sarah checked her ammunition one final time. She had 27 rounds remaining in her current magazine, plus the partial magazine in her pocket and 15 rounds in her sidearm. Against an enemy force of at least 20 fighters, those rounds would have to be enough to either defeat the attack or die fighting. She said a silent prayer and prepared for what might be her final battle. The final enemy assault began with a concentrated barrage of mortar fire that shook the ground beneath Sarah's feet. 3 rounds impacted within the small perimeter where her team had taken shelter, filling the air with dust, smoke, and deadly fragments. The concussive blasts were so intense that Sarah felt her teeth rattle in her skull, and her ears were ringing so loudly that she could barely hear Sergeant Rodriguez shouting orders. Through the smoke and chaos, Sarah could see Taliban fighters advancing from multiple directions. They were no longer bothering with stealth or tactical movement. This was a final assault designed to overwhelm the American position through sheer firepower and numbers. The enemy fighters were firing continuously as they advanced, filling the air with a deadly hail of bullets that chipped stone from the walls and sent sparks flying from metal debris. Sarah's M4 spoke with deadly accuracy as she engaged the closest threats. Each shot was carefully aimed, and she watched enemy fighters stumble and fall as her bullets found their marks. But for every fighter she dropped, 2 more seemed to take his place. The Taliban had committed significant resources to eliminating this small American unit, and they were willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve their objective. Private Chen's position came under intense pressure as enemy fighters concentrated their assault on what they perceived as the weakest point in the defensive line. Sarah could see him frantically changing magazines, his hands shaking from a combination of adrenaline and fear. She redirected her own fire to support him, but the enemy was pressing their attack with determination that bordered on fanaticism. The wounded specialist Johnson was semi-conscious and losing blood despite Corporal Park's continued efforts. His breathing was becoming shallow and labored, and Sarah realized that he was dying slowly from his wounds. Park was doing everything medically possible, but Johnson needed immediate surgical intervention that was impossible under the current circumstances. The knowledge that they might lose a teammate added urgency to their desperate defense. Sarah's rifle clicked empty again, and she realized with growing horror that she had just fired her last full magazine. She still had the partial magazine with approximately 10 rounds plus her sidearm, but that was all the ammunition standing between her team and complete annihilation. She made the tactical decision to switch to her Beretta pistol for close-range targets while conserving her remaining rifle. Ammunition for critical shots, the enemy. Fighters had closed to within 50 meters of the American positions. At this range, Sarah could see their faces clearly and observe their individual tactical movements. Some were experienced fighters who moved with the confidence of veterans, while others appeared to be younger men who were probably local recruits with minimal training. But all of them were armed and determined to overrun the American position. Sergeant Rodriguez had been hit in the shoulder by shrapnel from a mortar round, but he continued directing their defense despite his wound. Blood was soaking through his uniform sleeve, and Sarah could see that he was fighting through significant pain. His leadership and tactical knowledge were keeping them alive, but even his experience and skill could not overcome the basic mathematics of their situation. The Taliban fighters were using hand grenades to clear American positions, and Sarah heard the distinctive metallic sound of a grenade bouncing off stone near Private Chen's location. She shouted a warning, but the explosion came before Chen could react. The blast threw him backward, and Sarah could see that he was wounded and disoriented. His rifle had been damaged by the explosion, leaving him defenseless against the advancing enemy. Sarah made an immediate decision that would define the rest of her military career. Despite the extreme danger, she left her covered position and sprinted across open ground to reach Chen's location. Enemy bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she ran, but she reached Chen without being hit. She dragged him to better cover while simultaneously engaging enemy fighters with her pistol. The situation had deteriorated beyond any reasonable hope of survival. Sarah's team was down to 4 effective fighters. They were nearly out of ammunition, and they were surrounded by an enemy force that showed no signs of withdrawing. Specialist Walsh was still trying to establish radio contact, but the enemy jamming was completely blocking their communications. They were truly alone in their fight for survival. Sarah found herself in the unique position of having to make tactical decisions that would normally be made by officers or senior non-commissioned officers. With Sergeant Rodriguez wounded and focused on overall command, and the other team members either wounded or occupied with specific tasks, she had become the de facto leader of their immediate defensive sector. The responsibility was overwhelming, but her training and instincts guided her actions. The enemy fighters were now close enough that Sarah could hear them shouting to each other in Pashto as they coordinated their final assault. She didn't understand the language, but the tone and urgency of their communications made it clear that they were preparing for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm the American positions through sheer numbers and determination. Sarah's pistol ammunition was disappearing rapidly as she engaged multiple close-range targets. Each 15-round magazine seemed to last only seconds in the intense firefight, and she was down to her last magazine. She still had her partial rifle magazine, but she was saving those rounds for the most critical moments of the engagement. Every bullet had to count now. The sound of additional mortar rounds incoming caused everyone to take cover, but Sarah noticed that the rounds were impacting further away from their position. She realized that the enemy was shifting their mortar fire to prevent American reinforcements from reaching the battle site. This meant that help was probably approaching, but it also meant that her team would have to survive the final assault without immediate support. Corporal Park reported that Johnson had lost consciousness, and his pulse was becoming weaker. She was continuing to provide medical care, but she needed to focus more attention on her own defense as enemy fighters closed in on their position. The harsh reality of combat was that they might have to choose between protecting a dying teammate and defending themselves against imminent attack. Sarah could see enemy fighters moving through the ruins less than 30 meters away. They were using the same stone walls and debris for cover that her team had relied on, but now those barriers were working against the Americans. The Taliban fighters had gained intimate knowledge of the battlefield during the extended engagement, and they were using that knowledge to close the final distance to the American positions. The moment Sarah had been dreading finally arrived when her pistol slide locked back on an empty chamber. She had fired her last pistol round and was now down to the partial magazine for her rifle. She estimated that it contained perhaps 8 to 10 rounds, though she hadn't had time to count them carefully when she removed it earlier. Those rounds represented the last barrier between her team and complete defeat. The enemy assault was reaching its climax as Taliban fighters advanced from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah could see that they would be overrun within minutes unless something changed dramatically. She loaded her last rifle magazine and prepared to make every shot count in what appeared to be the final moments of a battle that had already lasted far longer than anyone could have expected. Sarah's world had narrowed to the immediate space around her rifle's front sight post. Each remaining round in her weapon represented a precious resource that could mean the difference between life and death. for her entire team. The Taliban fighters were now so close that she could see the determination in their eyes and the details of their weapons and equipment. Some carried the distinctive curved magazines of AK-47 rifles, while others had more modern weapons that suggested they were experienced fighters rather than local recruits. The sound of gunfire was now almost continuous, creating a deafening cacophony that made communication nearly impossible. Sarah had to rely on hand signals and situational awareness to coordinate with her remaining teammates. Private Chen was still conscious but disoriented from the grenade blast, and she could see blood on his face from shrapnel wounds. His rifle was definitely out of commission, leaving him defenseless except for his sidearm. Sergeant Rodriguez was maintaining defensive fire despite his shoulder wound, but Sarah could see that he was struggling with the pain and blood loss. His normally steady hands were beginning to shake, and his rate of accurate fire was decreasing as fatigue and shock began to affect his performance. Specialist Walsh had given up trying to establish radio communications and was now focused entirely on defensive fire with his M4 carbine. The enemy fighters were using a tactic that Sarah recognized from her training as fire and movement. While some fighters provided covering fire, others would advance to new positions closer to the American perimeter. The coordination and discipline suggested that they were facing experienced insurgents rather than hastily assembled local militia. This realization made their situation even more desperate, as experienced fighters would be harder to discourage and more likely to press their attack to completion. Sarah's rifle cracked as she engaged a Taliban fighter who had gotten within 20 meters of their position. The shot was perfect, center mass, and the fighter dropped immediately. But her satisfaction was short-lived, as she realized she now had only 7 or 8 rounds remaining. At this rate, she would be completely out of ammunition within minutes, leaving her team defenseless against the final enemy assault. The wounded Johnson had stopped breathing, and Corporal Park was performing chest compressions while trying to maintain her own defensive fire. The sight of their teammate dying added an element of grief and anger to the already intense emotions of combat. Sarah felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. Johnson's sacrifice would not be in vain if she could somehow find a way to save the rest of her team. The enemy mortar fire had stopped, which meant that the Taliban fighters were now too close to the American positions for indirect fire support. This was both good and bad news for Sarah's team. They no longer had to worry about mortar rounds, but the cessation of indirect fire also meant that the enemy was preparing for their final assault. The most dangerous part of the battle was about to begin. Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision and turned to see a Taliban fighter attempting to flank their position through a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of the abandoned village. The fighter was armed with an RPG launcher, and Sarah realized that a rocket-propelled grenade fired from that position would devastate their defensive perimeter. She made the difficult decision to expend 2 precious rifle rounds to eliminate this critical threat. The distance to the RPG gunner was approximately 60 meters, at the extreme effective range for accurate pistol fire, but well within range for her M4 carbine. Sarah's first shot missed as the target moved, but her second shot struck the fighter's center mass, causing him to drop the RPG launcher and fall backward into the ditch. The successful engagement had cost her 2 rounds, leaving approximately 6 rounds in her rifle, but eliminating the RPG threat had probably saved multiple lives. Private Chen had recovered sufficiently to use his sidearm, but his accuracy was poor due to his injuries and the disorientation from the grenade blast. Sarah could see him firing rapidly, but missing most of his targets, wasting ammunition that they could not afford to lose. She called out to him, trying to remind him to aim carefully and make every shot count, but the noise of battle made verbal communication nearly impossible. The Taliban fighters were now preparing for what appeared to be their final coordinated assault. Sarah could see them gathering in covered positions around the American perimeter, clearly preparing to rush the defensive positions simultaneously from multiple directions. This tactic would overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers, as the small defending force would not be able to engage multiple targets fast enough to prevent being overrun. Sarah made a tactical assessment of their remaining capabilities and concluded that they had perhaps 2 minutes before the enemy assault would reach their positions. With her remaining rifle ammunition, she might be able to engage 6 to 8 targets effectively. Private Chen's pistol contained perhaps 10 rounds, though his accuracy was questionable. Sergeant Rodriguez had an unknown amount of ammunition remaining, but his wound was affecting his ability to fight effectively. The realization that they were about to be overrun was both terrifying and oddly liberating for Sarah. She had done everything possible within her training and capabilities to defend her team and complete their mission. If they were going to die in this abandoned village, they would die fighting as American soldiers should, taking as many enemy fighters with them as possible. Sarah's thoughts briefly turned to her family back in Texas. Her parents would be devastated by news of her death, but she hoped they would understand that she had died serving her country and protecting her fellow soldiers. Her younger brother would continue the family tradition of military service, and perhaps her sacrifice would inspire him to be even better at his chosen profession. The sound of automatic weapons fire intensified as the enemy fighters began their final approach. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 12 different positions, indicating that the surviving Taliban force still significantly outnumbered her depleted team. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. They were outnumbered at least 3-1, nearly out of ammunition, and had no prospect of reinforcement or escape. Sarah's M4 carbine fired its final rounds as she engaged the closest enemy fighters. Each shot was carefully aimed and resulted in an enemy casualty. But when her rifle clicked empty on an open chamber, she knew that phase of the battle was over. She was now armed only with her Beretta pistol, which she had reloaded with her final magazine during a brief lull in the fighting. The Taliban fighters were now within hand grenade range, and Sarah could hear the metallic sounds of pins being pulled and spoons being released. She pressed herself against the stone wall that had been her protection throughout the engagement, knowing that grenades would likely end their resistance. The explosions would either kill them outright or leave them too wounded to continue fighting. As Sarah prepared for what appeared to be the final moments of her life, she heard a sound that seemed impossible under the circumstances. The distinctive crack of an American M4 carbine was coming from a position outside their defensive perimeter. Someone else was engaging the Taliban fighters, and the rate of fire suggested it was someone with military training and plenty of ammunition. The unexpected sound of friendly fire came from the north side of the village, where Sarah had not seen any American forces during the entire engagement. The distinctive report of M4 carbines was unmistakable, and the disciplined rate of fire indicated that whoever was shooting had military training and significant combat experience. Sarah felt a surge of hope that she had not experienced since the battle began hours earlier. Through the smoke and dust, Sarah caught glimpses of figures moving with professional precision among the ruins. These were not the reinforcements her team had been expecting. The movements were too fluid, too coordinated, and too effective to be regular army infantry. These fighters were engaging multiple Taliban positions simultaneously, while advancing through terrain that would have stopped less experienced soldiers. The Taliban fighters who had been preparing their final assault were now caught between two forces. The unexpected arrival of additional American fighters had disrupted their carefully planned attack and forced them to redirect their attention to threats coming from multiple directions. Sarah could hear confused shouting in Pashto as enemy commanders tried to reorganize their assault in the face of this new tactical situation. One of the newcomers appeared through the smoke near Sarah's position, moving with the silent efficiency of a ghost. He was dressed in different gear than her team, with specialized equipment that marked him as special operations. His movements were so smooth and controlled that he seemed to flow between cover positions without ever presenting a clear target to enemy fighters. This was clearly someone with extensive combat experience in similar terrain. The special operations soldier assessed Sarah's situation with a single glance that took in her empty rifle, her defensive position, and the tactical situation around her. Without speaking, he reached into his gear and pulled out two 30-round magazines for the M4 carbine. He placed them next to Sarah's position and gave her a brief nod before disappearing back into the smoke to continue engaging enemy targets. Sarah grabbed the magazines with hands that were steadier than she had expected. The weight of the loaded magazines felt incredible after hours of carefully rationing her dwindling ammunition supply. She loaded one magazine into her rifle and chambered a round, feeling a surge of confidence as she prepared to rejoin the fight with renewed capability. The other magazine went into her gear as backup ammunition. The arrival of the special operations team had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the engagement. The Taliban fighters were no longer conducting a coordinated assault against a fixed defensive position. Instead, they found themselves engaged in a fluid battle against experienced fighters who were using advanced tactics and superior training to systematically eliminate enemy positions. Sarah could see the special operations soldiers working in pairs, with one providing covering fire while the other advanced to a better position. Their coordination was flawless and their marksmanship was exceptional. Taliban fighters who had been providing effective fire against Sarah's team were being eliminated with precisely placed shots from ranges that demonstrated superior training and equipment. The enemy mortar fire resumed, but now the Taliban forward observers were confused about target locations. Some rounds were falling near Sarah's original position, while others were impacting near the positions where the special operations team was maneuvering. The lack of accurate targeting indicated that the enemy's command and control structure was breaking down under pressure from multiple directions. Private Chen had recovered enough to provide more effective fire support. Encouraged by the arrival of reinforcements and the renewed hope of survival, his pistol accuracy had improved as his disorientation faded, and he was beginning to engage targets more selectively rather than firing rapidly at unclear threats. The presence of professional soldiers had a calming effect on the entire team. Sergeant Rodriguez was still directing their defense despite his wound, but Sarah could see relief in his eyes as he realized that they might actually survive this engagement. His tactical knowledge was being supplemented by the expertise of the special operations soldiers, creating a combined force that was far more effective than the sum of its individual parts. One of the special operations soldiers had taken a position that provided overwatch for Sarah's team while simultaneously engaging enemy fighters who were trying to escape the village. His precision shooting was eliminating Taliban fighters who had been causing problems for Sarah's team throughout the engagement. Each shot seemed to find its target regardless of range or concealment. The Taliban fighters were beginning to realize that their tactical situation had become untenable. Instead of overwhelming a small isolated American unit, they found themselves trapped in a village with professional soldiers who possessed superior training, better equipment, and tactical advantages. Some enemy fighters were beginning to withdraw from their positions, abandoning the attack in favor of escape. Sarah used her renewed ammunition supply to engage fleeing enemy fighters, but she was careful to identify valid targets and avoid wasting rounds on unclear threats. The discipline she had learned during her ammunition shortage continued to guide her shooting even though she now had adequate supplies. Every shot was still carefully aimed and purposeful. The special operations soldier who had provided her with ammunition reappeared near her position during a lull in the fighting. He was a Navy SEAL, as evidenced by his distinctive gear and the professional competence with which he moved through the battlefield. He checked on her condition and the status of her team, while simultaneously maintaining situational awareness of potential threats. "How are you holding up, soldier?" he asked, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. Sarah could see that he was assessing her condition and tactical capabilities while asking the question. His presence radiated the confidence that came from extensive combat experience in similar situations. "We're still in the fight," Sarah replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. The SEAL nodded approvingly, recognizing the determination and professionalism that had kept her team alive during the extended engagement. He could see that she was a capable soldier who had performed well under extreme pressure. The SEALs team continued their systematic elimination of enemy resistance throughout the village. Their tactics were more aggressive than Sarah's defensive approach, but they had the training and equipment to conduct offensive operations in this type of terrain. Each movement was calculated to maximize their advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. As the immediate threat began to diminish, Sarah realized that her ordeal was finally coming to an end. The arrival of the SEAL team had not only saved her life, but had also validated her performance during one of the most challenging situations any soldier could face. She had kept her team alive through superior marksmanship, tactical awareness, and sheer determination when defeat seemed inevitable. The final phase of the battle unfolded with remarkable speed, as the SEAL team systematically eliminated the remaining Taliban resistance. Their professional efficiency was a stark contrast to the desperate defensive fighting that Sarah's team had endured for hours. Within 30 minutes of their arrival, the village was secure and the immediate threat had been neutralized. The silence that followed the last gunshot was almost as shocking as the initial rocket attack had been. Sarah found herself sitting against the same stone wall that had protected her throughout the engagement. But now the experience felt surreal rather than terrifying. Her hands were no longer shaking. Her breathing had returned to normal, and the hyper-awareness that had kept her alive was gradually fading as her nervous system began to process the fact that she had survived. The loaded rifle across her knees seemed almost foreign after hours of counting every remaining round. The SEAL team leader approached Sarah's position to conduct a tactical debrief and assess the condition of her unit. His name was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, and his calm professionalism helped Sarah organize her thoughts and provide a coherent account of the engagement. Thompson listened carefully to her description of events, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of small unit tactics and combat dynamics. "You did outstanding work here, Martinez," Thompson said after hearing her account. "Your team held against overwhelming odds for over 4 hours. That kind of performance saves lives and completes missions." His words carried the weight of someone who had seen enough combat to recognize exceptional performance when he encountered it. The medical evacuation of Specialist Johnson became the immediate priority once the area was secure. Despite Corporal Park's heroic efforts throughout the engagement, Johnson had died from his wounds during the final phase of the battle. The knowledge that they had lost a teammate cast a shadow over their survival. But Sarah understood that Johnson's sacrifice had not been in vain. His team had survived to fight another day. Private Chen required immediate medical attention for his shrapnel wounds and possible concussion from the grenade blast. The SEAL team's medic provided advanced trauma care that went far beyond the basic first aid that Corporal Park had been able to provide during the engagement. Chen would survive his injuries, though he would require extensive medical treatment and rehabilitation. Sergeant Rodriguez's shoulder wound was more serious than he had admitted during the fighting, but his leadership throughout the engagement had been crucial to their survival. The combination of his tactical knowledge and Sarah's marksmanship had kept the team fighting effectively, even when their situation seemed hopeless. Thompson made sure that Rodriguez received appropriate recognition for his performance under fire. The arrival of conventional Army reinforcements shortly after the SEAL team had secured the area provided additional security and logistical support for the evacuation process. Sarah learned that multiple units had been attempting to reach their position throughout the engagement, but enemy resistance and difficult terrain had delayed the relief efforts for hours longer than anyone had anticipated. Sarah's performance during the engagement became the subject of immediate attention from her chain of command. The combination of accurate marksmanship, tactical awareness, and leadership under extreme pressure had impressed everyone who heard the details of the battle. Her ability to conserve ammunition while maintaining effective fire had been crucial to their survival during the final phase of the engagement. The SEAL who had provided Sarah with ammunition introduced himself as Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison. He explained that his team had been conducting a separate operation in the area when they heard the sustained gunfire and realized that American forces were in contact with a significant enemy force. Their decision to intervene had probably saved Sarah's entire team from annihilation. Morrison's gesture of sharing his ammunition with Sarah represented more than simple battlefield cooperation. It demonstrated the bond that exists between professional soldiers, regardless of their specific branch of service or unit affiliation. In that moment, Sarah had not been an Army soldier and Morrison had not been a Navy SEAL. They had simply been American warriors fighting a common enemy. The debriefing process revealed that Sarah's team had faced a Taliban force of approximately 30 fighters, including several foreign advisors who had provided tactical guidance and advanced weapons training. The enemy had planned the attack carefully, using detailed knowledge of the terrain and American tactical procedures to create what should have been an overwhelming ambush. Sarah's team had survived through a combination of training, determination, and exceptional individual performance. Sarah's ammunition conservation during the engagement became a case study that was later used in military training programs. Her ability to maintain accurate fire while carefully managing her limited ammunition supply demonstrated the importance of marksmanship training and tactical discipline under pressure. Military instructors would use her example to teach future soldiers about resource management in combat situations. The psychological impact of the engagement took time to fully manifest. Sarah experienced the normal stress reactions that follow intense combat, but her overall mental health remained stable due to the positive outcome of the battle and the recognition she received for her performance. The knowledge that she had saved lives and completed her mission successfully helped her process the traumatic aspects of the experience. Sarah's military career was forever changed by the events in that abandoned Afghan village. Her performance under extreme pressure had demonstrated leadership potential that her superiors had not previously recognized. She was recommended for advanced training and increased responsibility, setting her on a path toward senior leadership positions within the military. The relationship between Sarah and the SEAL team members evolved into lasting, professional friendships based on mutual respect and shared combat experience. Morrison's simple act of providing ammunition when she needed it most had created a bond that transcended service rivalries and unit affiliations. They had faced death together and emerged stronger for the experience. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that November day as the defining moment of her military career. The engagement had tested every aspect of her training, character, and determination. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she had not known existed, and she had earned the respect of some of the military's most elite warriors. The empty rifle that had seemed like a death sentence had ultimately led to recognition, advancement, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a professional soldier. The story of Sarah Martinez and her desperate stand in an Afghan village became part of military lore, inspiring future generations of soldiers to maintain their discipline and determination, even when facing impossible odds. Her example demonstrated that individual performance could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, and that properly trained soldiers could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges through skill, courage, and mutual support. The ammunition that Morrison had shared with Sarah represented more than just bullets and gunpowder. It symbolized the trust, cooperation, and brotherhood that binds American military personnel together, regardless of their individual backgrounds or unit affiliations. In the moment when death seemed certain, one warrior had reached out to help another, and that simple act had changed the course of the battle and saved multiple lives.